Oh, hello! Today, we're going to talk about Chester Arthur. Who's Chester Arthur? Well, Chester Arthur is the 21st president of the United States. He's also like the least recognized president. So if Chester Arthur were to walk in the room, you'd be like, who are you? Nah, you wouldn't do that. But if you saw his name on a list, you might be like, who's that? It's Chester Arthur. Who's Chester Arthur? As we said, Chester Arthur is the 21st president of the United States. So why does that matter? Well, that's a good question. So we need to go back in time to 1880. It's 1880. And the big issue of the day is civil service reform. I know, big stuff. So the party at that time was divided, the Republican Party was divided into two factions. You had the Stalwarts, which is a cool name, and the Stalwarts believed in the patronage system, basically how things were. They believed that the spoil system, that the government elected officials should be able to appoint their friends of their friends to jobs, whether they were qualified or not. The other group is called the half-breeds. And that is not a cool name. And I looked it up, and I really couldn't find a good explanation as to why they were called that, but they were, so that's what they were, the half-breeds. And the half-breeds believed in civil service reform. They believed that in order to have a job with the government, you had to be qualified. What? But that's what they believed. So the party was split, and they couldn't decide between candidates, and they basically settled on James Garfield. Who was James Garfield? Well, James Garfield was a half-breed. And that sounds very insulting if you take it out of context, so don't do that. But he was a half-breed who believed strongly in civil service reform. Beyond that, he was a Civil War general. He was a very popular. He hated Mondays, loved lasagna. Yeah. So, in order to balance the ticket, they had to find a stalwart. So they asked a bunch of people, and a bunch of people said no. Because back then, being vice president was boring. Finally, they were like looking at the party. Garfield was from Ohio, and they thought, well, let's get a guy from New York. And in New York, there was a guy named Roscoe Conkling. And Roscoe Conkling was the stalwart of stalwarts, which sounds cool, but it wasn't so great because people didn't like him that much. He ran the political machine in New York, and they were not going to ask Roscoe Conkling to be vice president, but what they did do is they asked his number one right-hand man, and that man was, you guessed it, Chester Arthur. And when they asked Arthur, Arthur went to Conkling and said, hey, they want me to be vice president. And Conkling said, you will say no. And like the only time, at least up to here, foreshadowing, that Arthur actually said no to Conkling, he said no. He said, I cannot imagine a higher honor being offered to me or something like that. I butchered it, but you got the idea. So Arthur accepts. So Garfield gets elected, and Arthur is now vice president. And here's the crazy thing about that. Arthur actually continued to work for Conkling, even though he was vice president for Garfield. So in a way, well, it's not in a way, pretty much directly, he was working against Garfield. So the vice president was working against the president, which is kind of hard to imagine. But it happened before, it happened then, not so much anymore, but it was a thing. Then, one day, early in his presidency, Garfield's going to go visit his family. So he's walking through this train station, and he gets shot twice by a guy named Charles Guiteau. So who's Charles Guiteau? So Charles Guiteau was a disgruntled office seeker, which translated means a crazy guy who thought he should be ambassador to France. I'm not kidding you. Why did Charles Guiteau believe that he should be ambassador to France? That's a good question. He believed it because he gave a speech to like 10 people about Garfield. And because Garfield won, Guiteau felt like he had helped Garfield win and therefore deserved to be ambassador to France. And yes, that is a reach. But that's what he believed. He gave a speech to like 10 people. And the funny thing about that speech is that he actually wrote that speech for Grant. Because, you know, Grant was going to come back in 1880 and run again for a third term, which we don't do. But he was going to do it. Didn't happen. But he wrote the speech for Ulysses S. Grant. And then he basically, Guiteau did, went through the speech and changed everywhere it said Ulysses S. Grant. He changed it to say Garfield, James Garfield. And then he gave the speech to like 10 people. And back then, you know, you could just walk into the White House and be like, hey, hey, President, give me a job. And that's what Guiteau was doing. He kept coming in the White House and asking for a job, and they kept kicking him out because he's crazy. Look at his picture. He's crazy. But they kept kicking him out. And he got disgruntled. That's where that comes in, the disgruntled office seeker. And so he started stalking Garfield, and then he came up from behind at the train station. He shot him twice. So Garfield's wounded, and here's the thing, sad story, we'll talk about another time. But the bullets didn't actually kill Garfield. They did. I mean, the bullets did, but it was really the doctors that killed Garfield. Just the best intentions, but the treatment was awful. We'll talk about it another time. It's really sad, but Garfield lingers for a while. And finally, when the doctors have killed him completely, Arthur becomes president. And nobody thought that was a good idea. In fact, one guy, when he heard the news, declared, "Good God, Arthur is president." Might have said it differently than that. But nobody thought it was a good idea. And one person who also didn't think it was a good idea was actually Chester Arthur. Because when Chester Arthur found out he was going to be president of the United States, you know what he did? He cried. And then he went for a long walk. And yeah, he was sad that Garfield died, but he was actually sad, cried, because he was overwhelmed because he knew he had no business being president. Because the thing is, prior to his election as vice president, he'd never held an elected position in his life. In fact, the only position he'd really held was the collector of the ports of New York, which was like the ultimate spoils system position, because in that job, you got to inspect shipments coming into the New York harbor. And then, if you found something wrong, you charged a penalty, and then you got to keep part of the penalty. I mean, tell me that's not an opportunity for corruption. Arthur took advantage. In fact, you could say that Arthur was a corrupt political machine hack prior to becoming president of the United States. But here's the thing. This is what's cool about Chester Arthur, is that he totally rose to the occasion. In fact, Arthur was a pretty good president. You just don't hear his name anywhere. We covered that. But during his presidency, they passed the Pendleton Act. Whoa, Pendleton Act. What is that? That is the first real attempt at civil service reform. And again, I know it was a big deal in the 1880s. But here it is, the ultimate spoils system stalwart is actually the guy that enforced civil service reform. He appointed staunch half-breeds to these positions in order to make sure the law got carried out. That's pretty exciting. And it's not the only thing he did. I mean, that was his big thing, but he also modernized the Navy. We started making steel ships instead of wood. Crazy. He started, the Naval Academy was formed when he was president. And he also fixed up the White House. So it's a little debatable. I mean, the White House was in bad shape when he got there, and he fixed it up. Made it more presentable, made it more dignified. Jackie Kennedy didn't necessarily like what he did, and in fact, there's a quote where she said that she was going to undo all the awful things that Arthur did, but, you know, different ages, different timings, it's like 80, 90 years later. But he did fix up the White House. But the big thing he did was civil service reform. And when he left office, he did kind of a half-hearted attempt at getting nominated for another term of his own, but first of all, that didn't really happen back then with vice presidents. And second, he knew he had a chronic disease, and sadly, he actually died like 2 years after he left office, which is sad. But he left office to acclaim, mild acclaim, but even Mark Twain said that he could not think of any finer administration than that of Chester Arthur. And why we care what Mark Twain has to say, I don't know. But people like Mark Twain, so Mark Twain liked Chester Arthur, so that should be good. But here's the big takeaway from Chester Arthur's presidency. Chester Arthur had no business being president. He knew it. The country knew it. He totally rose to the occasion. Why did he rise to the occasion? There's a couple of theories. One of them is that he admired Garfield so much that he chose to try to, emulate him because of his character. Another is that he was receiving these letters from this woman that he didn't even know, named Julia Sands. She was like this invalid who lived in New York City, and she sent him these letters saying, remember when you were young and not corrupt? Be that guy again. And he did. So think about that. The next time you have a situation where you got a job you think you're not qualified for, a task you can't do, just keep in mind that Chester Arthur had no business being president, and he was a good one. So if Chester Arthur can be a good president, then you can be a good fill in the blank. So there you have it. That's Chester Arthur. Hope you enjoyed that, and thank you for listening.